Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. Today's video is going to be on the Game Week 25 cheat sheet. Now, just to preface, on Game Week 28, as you can see on the fixture column, I will not be showing whether any blank game weeks are featuring on Game Week 28, but you need to understand this screenshot here that has been created from a screenshot of Ben Krellin's Excel spreadsheet. He's, of course, the best FPL planner that we have around in terms of allowing us to understand fixture probabilities and also blank game weeks and double game weeks as they stand. So blank Game Week 28 is not confirmed. It actually will only be confirmed after the Game Week 25 deadline because it's based on the results of FA Cup fixtures in the future. We can see that Southampton versus Tottenham, Man City versus West Ham, and Brighton versus Man United seem to be almost confirmed blanks. However, with Brentford versus Leicester, there's less likelihood of that happening, and then even less likelihood of Liverpool versus Fulham or Wolves versus Leeds happening. Now that game and that blank is entirely dependent on the result of Fulham versus Leeds in the FA Cup. If Fulham lose, then Liverpool versus Fulham will be played in Game Week 28. If Leeds lose, then Wolves versus Leeds will happen in Game Week 28. So you can see, of course, your investment strategy into Game Week 25 assets and Liverpool assets more specifically is going to be dependent on this fixture. If you're planning on free hitting it on 28, I think you can feel quite safe in terms of investing and probably going deep into Liverpool assets this week because you'll know worst case scenario, you'll just be free hitting on 28. If you don't have a free hit, I think that actually makes you in a tougher position because you don't want to be over investing into Liverpool on the very likely chance that Fulham actually beat Leeds in the FA Cup. However, if Leeds do pull out a miracle and Fulham actually lose, then owning a lot of Liverpool assets this week can be even better because it might allow you to sidestep Game Week 28 and the free hit there and actually just simply go towards Game Week 29 and free hit there, or think about covering free hit on the 32 game week where you have a blank game week once again. And so that's the future likelihood of the blank Game Week 28 possibilities. Just keep that in mind when you look at the fixtures of the cheat sheet assets. As far as the cheat sheet, in terms of the budget mids, what I've done here, even though of course we have to preface that Brighton have a Game Week 25 blank, is that I've risen March back to the level of Mitoma. I think we've seen enough sample size now where March and Mitoma for me are very, very similar as assets. There has been some games where Mitoma has been completely dominant, their kind of outlet in terms of dribbling, but March himself has found so many great opportunities to score, and his underlying numbers have consistently stayed above someone like Mitoma. Their assist numbers are very, very similar, and I think at this point you're talking about a system where it's entirely dependent on your FPL team structure, whether you own two of them or just one of them. If you own Saka, Odegaard, Rashford, Salah, then you're probably only going to go into one Brighton asset in the future in terms of the midfield. However, if you're someone who, let's say, doesn't own Salah, or you're someone who doesn't own Odegaard, but you own Nketiah instead, and you only own one Arsenal midfielder, then you actually have the chance to go into two Brighton midfielders. And I think it's actually preferential to go into these two Brighton midfielders because I think they're actually better assets than Estupiñán or Dunk going forwards. And I think that's the value of this great team here where Mitoma and March are the leaders, I would say, in terms of minutes, the lack of rotation that they actually get. And compared to McAllister, there's less, I think, variance in terms of what sort of position McAllister occupies on the pitch, because McAllister can play as a 10, as he has in recent games, or he could also be defaulted back into the center mid position, whereas with Mitoma and March, they're clearly the leading forwards in this system on the left and right flank. So this is what I have to say for now. As far as McNeil and Sarabia, these are two assets that have been added to the cheat sheet because of their strength as a stopgap this week. In Game Week 25, if you're thinking about, let's say, cheap budget mid transfers that can hold you over Game Week 25 and that have a decent ceiling, McNeil and Iwobi probably come to mind for Everton. But the reason why I've actually gone for McNeil, just to make it clearer what my opinions are between McNeil and Iwobi, is that they will share these sort of set piece opportunities, but I think McNeil is actually simply a better set piece deliverer, and you can see that clearly with his assist numbers going historically. I would also say that McNeil probably will lose a little bit of minutes in terms of Demarai Gray and whether he comes back into the side, but I still think the upside is there because if you're looking at Everton and open play, Iwobi obviously is much more suited to being able to score an open play, but McNeil, the better set piece taker, is probably someone that you'd prefer to go for because Everton's open play numbers so far have been terrible under Sean Dyche. So this is the kind of style that they're going for. I think McNeil probably better suits this team as things stand. As far as Sarabia, he's someone who's interesting because of course Podence isn't really an option this week with Wolves, and he therefore becomes that sort of budget midfielder for this Wolves team that seems to be quite interesting, who's actually gotten some decent numbers as of late, most recently in the Bournemouth game as an example, alongside someone like Matheus Cunha. But Sarabia for me is one to think about this week if you just need a stopgap for Wolves. What I will say about Everton and Wolves and these two teams teams is that Everton seem to be the better team to go for if you're looking at stopgaps, because in game week 28 and game week 32, when we have these big blank game weeks, you will have these Everton teams and Everton players playing over a long-term fixture period. So I think McNeil is someone that I prefer, and that's going to be my opinions for this week. As far as 6.0 to 6.9, you're looking at Grealish falling, and the reason why isn't because he is any less nailed than he is. I think he's actually more nailed than both Mahrez and Foden on the right-hand side. You'll see that Pep's recent comments have been that Mahrez is almost competing in that position with Foden, whereas I would say Grealish just seemingly has a much lower ceiling than someone like Mahrez. Mahrez has operated, for example, in the Leipzig game, almost like a 10. He also gets to play right wing. He has better underlying stats when it comes to expected goals per 90, expected assists per 90. Grealish is someone who I think is interesting when it comes to owning City assets, but City actually have much less fixtures than we expected. They also don't double in game week 29, and you're looking for assets here to actually cover your team for this period. And I think if you're, let's say, a Grealish owner, it makes so much more sense to actually move into Mitoma and March immediately, as opposed to any other assets around this tier, or let's say even holding Grealish just because he gets to play versus Bournemouth once, as an example. So that's kind of my thoughts on Grealish. I think his ceiling isn't that high. As far as Martinelli, we've explained, of course, it's more of a rotation issue. Martinelli is independently a great asset, but Trossard coming into the team clearly has taken minutes off of him. And yes, whilst he scored a last-minute goal versus Aston Villa, I think you have to say he didn't really have too many chances that game other than a completely open net. So Barnes is an interesting asset because he actually scored 8 goals in open play, and he's someone who will be thought about in game week 29, that much in the same way that Maddison will. And potentially you'll only be competing between Barnes and Maddison for that lesser spot in your team, even Iheanacho, of course. I think Maddison's a little bit more interesting because he could have a higher ceiling when you think about his ability to actually create chances and therefore get bonus points. So that's something where I think any game Barnes and Maddison both score, it's always likely going to be a game where Maddison gets triple bonus points, just because of the way he plays, the way he dominates, and the way he actually creates for this team, as opposed to Barnes, who's a much more direct threat and probably has actually better expected goal per 90 numbers than a Maddison. As far as Ward-Prowse, he's just someone to think about on the side, just because Southampton actually have a decent run of fixtures, I would say, in game week 25 and 26, and then also getting that double game week in 27. But for me, I'm not too interested in Southampton assets, I have to say that. And we've talked about Ward-Prowse time and time again, someone who doesn't really seem to benefit this sort of attacking of fixtures, because free kicks are so invariable. I wouldn't say that people expected Chelsea to be an easy game to score versus, and you can clearly see that Chelsea have been a good defense under Potter, even though they've been very stale on attack. But expecting Ward-Prowse to score in that game probably isn't something that a lot of people would have done. So that's sort of the idiosyncrasy of Ward-Prowse as an FPL asset. But if we move towards the other midfielders, what I have to say is Rashford rises towards the top, and he's also another asset that rises to the top even in spite of a game week 25 fixture and blank. The reality is you probably only want to be owning one United asset as we head towards game week 29. Maybe it would be Rashford and Shaw, but Rashford is clearly the United asset that you have to keep in your team post game week 25, because he's actually got great fixtures when it comes to attacking. Liverpool's great from the attacking point of view, less so interesting, I would say, to keep Shaw over that game. Southampton's also a great game, and then Brighton, of course, you still see opportunities for Rashford to do well there if for a magical reason you get that 2 to 3% chance that blank doesn't happen. But game week 29, of course, is going to be a mega Rashford week, and probably one where everyone's looking to captain Rashford on that week anyways. So he is an essential pick in FPL right now, and he just simply is a lock as a top position. As far as Mahrez, he falls, and that's not to say he's been a poor asset whatsoever. No, he's actually been City's leading attacker from the post-World Cup sort of recovery, and the way Pep has changed his team. Mahrez has been someone that you could rely upon consistently for points and be able to create for himself. However, Mahrez just simply has less fixtures than most players. He also has much more chances of being rotated. With especially this Leipzig draw, you're going to be expected he's going to be rested eventually for one of these games going forwards, where he's going to be rested up for the next Leipzig fixture, and therefore Mahrez is going to have less minutes. So that's kind of the picture as it stands. Simply with City not having a double game week fixture in game week 29, you could probably look at your FPL team and just say Haaland is the one asset that I want to keep from City, Mahrez probably the second, and everyone else can actually go into the bin. As far as Saka, Maddison, Bowen, Maddison has risen again for much the same reason that I've sort of loaded Barnes as an asset to think about. I think when you compare, let's say, Maddison, Bowen who's been introduced, they both have a game week 29 fixture. Bowen, of course, has a better trajectory in terms of how he will be able to cover the gaps, because Game Week 25, of course, is an opportunity for you to look at an asset that actually has a good fixture in 25 and then also a good fixture in 29. But I would say Maddison just seems to be the more interesting asset with a higher ceiling, because this Leicester team have been much more consistent in terms of creating attacking chances. And Maddison, of course, with the sort of creation that he's consistently being able to put out, is going to benefit from bonus points in that ceiling. Whereas with Bowen, I would say if you look at West Ham's XG numbers, if you look at Bowen's independent expected goal involvement numbers, they do fall far short of a team like Leicester and also an asset like Maddison. So I do think preferring Maddison is the way to go. Game Week 29 seems to be great fixtures to attack from the Leicester attack. So Maddison is someone to think about as a second-tier asset going forwards. Probably not a priority target for now, but you could think about him in Game Week 26 and even as soon as this week if for whatever reason you don't want to invest into Liverpool assets. As far as 10 plus players, De Bruyne simply has to fall. You have the illness news. Of course, he has a chance of playing versus Bournemouth, but even if he's ready to play versus Bournemouth, I just can't see why you don't want to attack the upside between going straight from KDB to Salah. If you're a Kane owner and you don't own De Bruyne, that's fine. Maybe you don't want to go into Salah this week, but if you're a De Bruyne owner, there's such a clear gulf in these two assets and what they present over this short fixture run, where I think Salah is much better if you're just wanting to chase upside and actually do well in FPL, specifically in Game Week 25. So I think Salah's a no-brainer here when it comes to De Bruyne. And look, not many people are going to have team structures where they own both Salah and De Bruyne, so it's such a clear-cut move for De Bruyne to actually fall towards a tier 3 asset this week, just to kind of show the difference between him and Salah and De Bruyne as assets. So in terms of the forwards this week, we actually have a situation where a lot of the forwards have dropped, and that's Mitrovic mostly, and Gnonto and Havertz as well. This is to show that I think the key assets in the game in terms of the forward position really are Nketiah, Felix, Tony, Watkins, Darwin, Haaland, and Kane. I think there's a clear gulf between these green assets and all these orange assets, and even Iheanacho, because Iheanacho is not really someone you want to think about as a Game Week 25 transfer, even though he's actually consistently building up his minutes. Brendan Rodgers has the faith of Iheanacho, so I hope that we'll see much less rotation of him and Iheanacho becomes an interesting asset by Game Week 29. But for now, you have to say that Felix has better attacking numbers than Havertz, so there's a clear difference there to be made between him and Havertz. He's played enough games and enough minutes, I would say, for the Chelsea team to say that his underlying numbers aren't super inflated. I think the eye test definitely passes more for Felix and Havertz. I wouldn't say either of them are clinical finishers, but I still back Felix to be the more interesting asset to own, and you're not going to own two Chelsea forwards. As far as Watkins, he just simply has such a great run of fixtures from Game Week 25 onwards, where I would even consider going for him if you weren't heavily invested into this Liverpool team. If you don't want to go for Darwin this week for whatever reason, going for Watkins is such a nice transfer away from someone like Mitrovic, who doesn't have good fixtures in the future, doesn't have blanks, and potentially will have a blank game week in Game Week 28 himself versus Liverpool. So this is the kind of landscape of FPL where someone like Mitrovic has to fall. Solanke has only really been added because he has a double game week fixture in Game Week 29. You might think about him as one of the forwards on your free hit. You probably wouldn't. As far as Johnson, very similar scenario there with Game Week 29 as well. And then with Gnonto, just someone who isn't that interesting because, of course, he's not someone where this Leeds team is consistently building chances around him. He's actually someone who plays extremely wide on the left, and even though he's such an intelligent player, it's still tough to expect Gnonto to do well, especially for this Leeds team that have consistently found it very hard to score, and he's more of a creative asset than anything, so the fact that they actually lack clinical finishing is going to be a concern for anyone owning Gnonto. I can see that he's actually gotten a rise this week simply because he plays, and I think people are looking towards Game Week 29 and being able to actually cover that fixture with someone who is at this sort of very, very cheap price point. But beyond, let's say, being a glue guy for your team, I think Gnonto doesn't really have much value whatsoever in FPL, and that's kind of the landscape of the forwards for me. As far as the defenders, just to round things out, because I think with keepers here, it's very easy to pick between the keepers. It's simply think about assets like Ramsdale, think about assets like Pickford, and think about assets like Sanchez and Raya. But beyond those keepers, if we look towards the defenders more so, I think Ben White has to rise again. And the reality is, he's such an interesting asset. And I actually went from White to Gabriel, and I slightly regret it because I think even though Gabriel still continuously shows that he's actually the key man in terms of when Arsenal look to create direct free kicks, or not direct free kicks rather, but actually free kicks into the box for someone to actually target, let's say, Gabriel is that direct threat. But you're also seeing Arsenal create a lot of set piece chances that don't involve going for and finding a header in the box. You can see so many chances actually built for Zinchenko, which is why he's risen in weeks, and also why we expected, let's say, a goal in the previous week, just simply because he's taking 4 to 5, 6 shots a game, which a lot of the teams are actually willing to give, because I think they don't really have the faith that Zinchenko can actually clinically finish. He has done so in the previous week, and it's interesting to see, of course, Zinchenko and maybe how his ownership will change in the future. But Ben White, similarly, is someone who is super exciting because he's very capable of playing this two-man game with Saka on the right. I think he's much more interesting than Tomiyasu from the offensive point of view, where he's actually able to loop these great crosses in the back post as well for someone like Nketiah to target. At the same time, Ben White, the way he plays, because he's so involved in the passing out of the back, he's probably likely to also get triple bonus points on a game week where, let's say, Saliba or Gabriel don't find the net themselves. So that's sort of the ceiling that you have with Ben White, and I'm really not too scared about some of these fixtures going forwards in terms of how often Tomiyasu will be rotated with him. So I actually like Ben White and re-rising him as an asset, even though I'm actually someone who went out of White quite shortly, or quite recently rather. As far as Kilman, I think he has to fall, because for me, Game Week 23 and 24 was actually the great window to own a Wolves asset, because you could have maybe sneaked and hopefully gotten clean sheets from Wolves, but they've actually disappointed from this point of view, actually getting sort of outscored by Bournemouth in the previous week, both from the underlying numbers and also just realistically just losing 0-1. I think this is unfortunately not the right time to go for a Wolves asset. You have a kind of concern over the Game Week 28 and the blank there. Leeds could actually still get the upside versus Fulham, and simply put, I think the fixtures are just worse in Game Week 25 versus Everton when you look at Fulham and Liverpool. I mean, Fulham and Liverpool are two of the best attacking teams in the league, and when you compare it to, let's say, Aston Villa and Arsenal, I would say Aston Villa, even though they've scored for some very, very big teams lately, I still think they're a worse offense than either of Fulham and Liverpool. So that's kind of how I see things as they stand. As far as Duncan and Stupinian, no changes there, because I think the priority still is to get Brighton midfielders first, and then maybe a Stupinian or Dunk second. You could also think about going for Sanchez to kind of cover and paper over the cracks there. As far as Gabriel, Saliba, Zinchenko, these are assets that we still have to keep as the top assets. Arsenal just have a great fixture run, have really good underlying numbers on defense, even though they've really upset us, I would say, from the clean sheet point of view post-World Cup, but you still have to consider them as great assets because they're still at great price points, and we still are simply lacking in defenders. When you look at City, there's so much variability between who actually starts on a game-to-game basis. You already have Champions League being another conflicting factor for City, and with Chelsea, it's very hard to see whether we really want to invest in a double up of Chelsea, because a lot of us own Kepa already. It's hard to see whether we want to invest into another Chelsea defender, and that's also why I've dropped Badia Shield. The reason why is because I think if you're ever to own another Chelsea defender, it really has to be Reece James for me. I think he's going to be someone who at least is a double-edged sword, so he covers you for these games when Chelsea actually disappoint yourselves, and at least he has this attacking upside that a lot of these defenders are able to rely upon when they have a good fixture, like a Shaw, like a Trent as an example. Shaw is someone who also falls this week, and I've also dropped Trippier for the same reasons. Maybe it's actually wrong for me to drop Trippier, because I think Trippier is someone that I prioritize over Shaw. So I would say Trippier is, let's say, a yellow asset in reality if you compare it to Shaw, but at that sort of tier, because so many assets are interesting now for Arnold, Robertson, James, and even Van Dijk in the short term. I just think it makes sense to class Trippier here. I can understand why some people have gone out of Trippier. It really depends on what their free hit strategy is over 28 and 29, but I think you'll be needing Trippier as soon as possible. With Bruno coming back, you're expecting the defensive numbers to improve. We've already talked about Trippier and how interesting he is as an asset, simply because he is still 4th in the league for expected assists per 90. He consistently creates some of the most threatening chances in the league. You can see the 10 versus 11 Liverpool game as a great example of how good Trippier is in that position. I don't think he's going to be dropped, even though people have criticized some of his defensive involvements, but that's sort of the landscape of FPL, where I think these Newcastle assets will be reconsidered immediately as soon as we hit Game Week 27, and Trippier will simply rise back to the top. Whereas with Shaw, you have a high chance of a Game Week 28 blank, and therefore he's probably going to only move towards a yellow sort of asset position because of that. As far as James, Robertson, Van Dijk, all assets I would say are secondary towards someone like Trent this week. I think Trent has better numbers than Robertson, less of a chance of being rotated, even though we have seen, of course, Trent being dropped in the Chelsea game as an example. But we've seen that Jurgen Klopp has shown a lot of faith over Trent in recent weeks, and I think Trent, from the eye test, has passed with flying colors. So does Robertson, to be honest. I mean, he was someone who saved an absolute tap-in from Real Madrid where Rodrigo could have easily scored. Robertson has played fantastically as well. I think the full-backs deserve a lot more credit than, unfortunately, any of the centre-backs for Liverpool right now. But Robertson is still, for me, the lower ceiling asset compared to Trent. So if you're really going to make one transfer for a Liverpool defender this week, it would have to be Trent first for me. And I really wouldn't consider a double up, which is why I've kind of priced Robertson and Van Dijk as lower tier assets in comparison to trend. And that's going to be the cheat sheet this week. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I'll see you guys shortly.